something in class or just want to review something, they're all posted every day on the website.
We'll show you what.
Yeah. So, welcome to a boot camp. Has anybody done a programming boot camp before? Probably not. So, I did go to college, but then later I decided to switch careers into programming. So I went through a couple boot camps actually. So met Davey at a 1-week boot camp, also on JavaScript. And then later on I did a 12-week boot camp on Ruby on Rails. And that was really what I used to get transitioned into programming as a career. So it's very different than your college courses. And who wants to read for me? Who knows how to read in here? All right, Chris, read me that.
To remain valuable in our economy, therefore, we must master the art of quickly learning complicated things. Cal Newport.
Thank you. Anybody familiar with Cal Newport? Not too much. Highly recommend reading some of his work. He does a lot of work into what he calls deep work, which is concentrated, uninterrupted work with no distractions, which is by far the best way to get things done. And the thing I like about the bootcamp environment is it really can recreate that. I mean, don't get me wrong, you can still certainly get distracted by stuff, but the idea of focusing on one thing intensely for a short period of time is a great thing, especially in the field of programming, because things change very, very quickly. The fundamental concepts of programming don't, but the particular language you may need to use for a project, the frameworks you may need to use, all that sort of stuff changes very quickly. For instance, last year when we did this, we taught Angular 1 as the framework. And since then, just in a year, we are now on Angular 4, which works entirely differently. React Router version 3 was the thing about 3 months ago. We're learning React Router version 4 now. Firebase completely changed, which is a backend database that we use in this class. So that happened like during the middle of class last year. So the point is, things change very quickly. So getting used to this kind of, why do we keep losing the screen for some reason today. Don't know why. Give me just a second, we'll get it back up here. At any rate, learning how to learn things very quickly is very invaluable. Come on. And we are still recording. I don't know why this Apple TV is giving us issues today, but so at any rate, what to expect from boot camp. Number one, it's a lot of hard work. I don't think that should be any surprise to you at this point with the amount of pre-work that we had, things like that. Another very important thing, you will learn a ton in a very short amount of time, but oddly enough, it may not actually feel like it. So this is one of the things I really found going through boot camp. You're focusing entirely on one thing for an extended period of time. And it's weird because it's one of those things where like the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. And then you feel like you don't know anything. So I remember it was about week 9 of the 12-week boot camp I went through. So we've been doing Ruby for like 9 weeks straight at this point, plus a couple months of pre-work before that. So but then I remember going to my instructor and saying, getting pretty close to graduating here, going to be looking for a job. I don't feel like I know anything at this point. And he was like, well, why don't you go back and look at your week 1 homework? So I did, and then I was like, okay, maybe we learned some things. The interesting thing is you're surrounded by people who are all doing the same thing. You're all going to be learning JavaScript. You're all going to be learning React. And you're all kind of learning at the same rate. And so you don't have a lot of interaction with people who don't know JavaScript during this time. So you can lose perspective of how much you're actually learning. So keep that in mind if you start to feel like you don't know anything. All right, so that's the expectations. And now for the tips. Number 1, you get out what you put in. So now that we've done a few boot camps, it becomes pretty apparent that some students like to put in a lot of work, and luckily most do. But they're the ones who get the most out of it by far and then have success getting internships with TechPoint next year or just internships with employers are the ones who tend to push themselves to get as much of the homework done as possible. And even if they do get all of the levels of homework. Many times there's multiple levels of difficulty. Still push themselves to add some originality to it or learn something new and put that in there. So push yourself to do as much of the homework as possible. And even if you manage to get all that done, it's programming. There's so much to learn. You're never completely done. So there's no limit to the amount of extra stuff you can do, whether that's reading additional documentation. We have all sorts of links to external tutorials or books or other online resources that we have. So really push yourself. And don't underestimate the value of continued effort over time. So for instance, this is probably one of the biggest lessons I've learned over the last few years is, so take 2 students. Say you get your homework today. 2 students leave here. Both of them get the homework done, and that's great. You learned a lot. You got some stuff done. One of them decides, hey, I'm going to read some additional documentation for an hour or read on this binding in JavaScript. So he spends an extra hour doing that. Tomorrow, they're not going to be that much different as JavaScript programmers, right? It's really only 1 hour of difference. You do that for 3 weeks, and now you've got 24, 25 hours difference, right? That's going to start to make a little difference. You do that for a whole year, and you're talking 400 or 500 hours of additional study. That can make a very large difference in your level of programming skill. So definitely getting in the habit of pushing yourself past the minimum is an excellent idea to get the most out of it. Tip number 2, try to solve the problems yourself. Seems pretty basic, but it's not as easy as you would think. There's probably going to be a lot of new concepts in here, and it can be very uncomfortable to feel like you don't necessarily know what you're doing. But that discomfort is just your brain growing. So get used to it and learn to love it. Also, break the problem down to its smallest components. I can remember when I was going through the boot camp, it was structured very similarly. We would have lecture in the morning and then work on projects in the afternoon. You guys are kind of flip-flopped, but same basic idea. But I remember every morning as I knew the lecture was coming to a close, I would get this like wave of anxiety because I knew we were about to get assigned homework. And I also knew that it was going to be very challenging and that I probably wouldn't know how to do some of it right off the bat. Because when you just hear the homework like as a whole, where it's like, okay, make a form that can take in some input, and then when you click on the button, it puts a person's name on the page, and then style that with the information from the form. And so when you hear the homework like as a bulk thing, you're like, oh man, there's so many steps of that I don't know how to do. Like, I don't even know where to begin. But then think about it and break it down to what is the very simplest thing I can start with. Okay, I need to put a form on the page. I could probably do that. Like, I can put 1 line input. Okay, I have an input. Now I need a button to submit. I could probably know how to do that. Okay, now I have a button. Now I need something to happen when I push that button. Do I know how to add an event listener? Yeah, I could probably do that. So break it down. It can be overwhelming to think of the project as a whole, but break it down into the smallest components, and that'll help you out a lot. And once again, documentation is always your best friend. So definitely try to solve the problems yourself. But tip number 3 is don't stay stuck on any one problem for too long. So we cover a lot of material. There's not time to stay stuck for an excessive amount of time. So kind of went the wrong way with this when I was in boot camp. I wanted to do everything on my own, and sometimes I would get stuck for an hour or 2 on something, and then when I would finally ask a question, it would be something really ridiculously small that I was just overlooking. And then you're like, why did I just waste 2 hours on that? So definitely try to solve the problems yourself, but ask for help when you need it. General formula that I was told going through boot camp, which worked really well for me, was first break the problem down. Are you really working on the smallest step that you possibly can? Have you read the documentation? Did you Google it? That's a very important one. We do encourage the use of Google. It's very helpful. And have you spent at least 15 minutes on it? If you meet all those criteria, that's probably a good time to ask. Could be asking the person next to you. Could be asking Davey or I. We'll typically be in this room throughout the day, but you can definitely send Slack messages to either of us, whichever one's not teaching at the time. If you guys are in the next room working in the mornings or just have questions at night. At night, we'll try to get back to you as often as we can, but obviously we have lives as well, but we'll get back to you as we can. But yeah, so if you meet those criteria, definitely ask questions. Don't waste hours stuck on one single thing, because it's a lot of times not something that is necessarily helpful. If it would be better just to get some advice and then so that you can move on to the next step.
If you send us a message in Slack during the morning class while you're next door, there's a pretty good chance we can pop over there and take a look at it for a few minutes.
Yeah.
And don't forget to use that in the morning.
All right. Tip number 4, learn from our mistakes. Because I guarantee at some point we will screw something up. So this was actually one of the most helpful things for me going through the boot camp. Has anybody done any online coding tutorials? Quite a few of you. So here's the thing about those. You are seeing probably the 4th or 5th revision, like a very polished final product. And I know when I was first learning, that was my entire experience before going to a boot camp, was just like online tutorials and books. And you're just always seeing, okay, and then do this step, and then do this step, and this step. And everything works almost perfectly the first time, right? And so I remember thinking like, man, I'm nowhere near to being a good programmer. And I don't know if I ever will be a good programmer, because in my mind, being a good programmer means you just write this thing and it works. And then you write this thing and it works. And you just build this thing up. That's not the way real programming goes. There are a lot of iterations. Oh, we lost it again. This thing is not being helpful today. So it helped me a lot to be in a class where some live programming was going on, and to see, I don't know if we're going to get this thing working again. Here we go. And to see what somebody who had a lot of programming experience did when they screwed up. A, that they do screw up frequently, and then how do they handle it? How do they use their console, their developer tools? How do they use debugger or console logs to figure out what the actual issue is? How do they read error messages? Like, what are they picking out of the error message to know what went wrong or be able to determine what went wrong? So yeah, tip number 5, don't compare yourself to others. There's a wide variety. I mean, I know you all are CS majors, all freshman or sophomore year pretty much. So there's a certain level of knowledge that you all have at this point. But, you know, like in the first cohort, we had somebody in there who had already done some JavaScript frameworks, not React, which is what we'll be learning, but they'd already done some Angular 2 and some Ember. And it would not at all be helpful for someone who had, this was like the first time you've seen JavaScript in your life, to compare yourself to that person, right? You just have different levels of experience and different backgrounds and different amounts of programming experience in general. Also, just in general, everybody finds different concepts difficult. So Davey will probably say something at some point and you're like, oh, that just clicks. That makes total sense. And then probably something 5 minutes later, you'll be like, I don't get that at all. And for somebody else, it's probably the reverse. So make sure you're just focusing on your own personal improvement and not comparing yourself to others, whether somebody else gets further in the homework or seems to grasp a concept faster. There's a lot of factors that go into that.
Related to those, if you happen to be a know-it-all, we're all very impressed. We already know how much you know, and we're all very impressed. So you don't need to interrupt class to show off how much you know. Just be like, oh, hey, isn't that kind of like this obscure property that I happen to know about? Why aren't you using it instead, man? Because we're not there yet. Be patient. So if your only reason for asking a question is to show off to the rest of the class how much you know, you can save it. We already know, and we're very impressed. Thank you. That is all. Not that this has ever happened before.
I will say,
It has not happened this summer. So.
which is why we keep giving the disclaimer. At any rate, it seems to be working. So, so definitely ask questions and like say things in class. We love participation, but yes, there have been a few times in the past where people were clearly just saying things to show how much they know. So try to avoid that if you can. Tip number 6, have a good time. So again, with an environment like this where you're constantly learning new stuff that you've probably not been exposed to every day, it's kind of easy to get mentally beat down over the course of 3 weeks because you constantly feel like you don't know what you're doing. So take some time when you do get things to work to celebrate your wins and appreciate your progress. If you get something to work, be like, yay, I got something to work. Now on to the next thing I have no idea how to do. Also, make some friends. Some of my best friends were people that I went through the boot camp with. It's an intense experience, and you're all doing the same thing together every day. And it's a good time to meet some people that you get along with. Like one of the guys that's probably one of my best friends now, and we frequently do like remote pair programming on the weekends still, even though that was like a year and a half ago. So good times. And finally, build some cool stuff. It'll be fun. We're going to build some fun stuff, have a good time, and you can do it. Believe in yourself as I believe in you. Let's do this. Let's learn some JavaScript. All right.
All right, one side question here.
Yes.
Who made the PowerPoint and why are they addicted to cats?
That was me. I do enjoy cats. I have one cat, and then I do have a girlfriend who has 3 cats, so now we have 4 cats. That was even more cats than I really want, but yeah, got a lot of cats. They're very amusing to me.
I have 2 myself. Yoshi and Furiosa. Not Furiosa, Furiosa. I was very proud of that. It was like a week after the movie came out. First person named their cat that.